The fluorescent lights of the executive locker room hummed their monotonous tune, that sterile corporate frequency that accompanied every moment of Malik Turner's invisible existence. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in downtown Chicago, in the sleek glass tower that housed Vanguard Global Industries, and Malik was doing what he'd done for the past 3 years. Emptying trash bins that cost more than his monthly rent, wiping down marble countertops that gleamed like frozen lakes, and pretending he didn't exist. But tonight, existence found him anyway. The polished mahogany door to the private executive section stood slightly ajar, a violation of protocol, a crack in the pristine armor of the 53rd floor. Malik hesitated, his cleaning cart creaking like a confession in the silence. He'd learned long ago that some doors weren't meant for men like him, men whose hands bore the calluses of survival, men whose reflection in those marble countertops looked more like a ghost than a person. Still, the lights were on. Someone was inside. He knocked, 3 soft taps that felt like apologies. No answer. Malik pushed the door open and stepped into a scene that would shatter every assumption he'd made about power, about pride, about the distance between heaven and earth. Xavier Caldwell, the Xavier Caldwell, CEO of Vanguard Global, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations, whose face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, whose decisions moved markets and toppled competitors, was on his knees. On his knees. In a $1,000 suit that draped over his frame like liquid silver, Xavier Caldwell knelt on the Italian tile floor of the locker room, a soft cloth in his hands, polishing a pair of battered work shoes. Not his own shoes, Malik's shoes. The worn-out Skechers with the peeling sole and the permanent stain from that chemical spill last winter. The shoes Malik had left beside his locker while he'd gone to mop the boardroom. The sight hit Malik like a fist to the chest, the cold sting of confusion, the weight of 1,000 silent questions pressing down on his lungs. Xavier didn't look up. His movements were deliberate, reverent even, each stroke of the cloth a ritual Malik couldn't comprehend. The sound of fabric against leather filled the space between them, a whisper that screamed louder than any words could. "Mr. Caldwell?" Malik's voice came out fractured, barely more than breath. That's when Xavier's hands stilled. That's when the billionaire's shoulders tensed beneath that perfect suit. That's when Xavier Caldwell raised his head and Malik saw something he'd never seen in the eyes of powerful men before. Tears. Not the polite moisture of sentiment, not the controlled emotion of a rehearsed speech, but the raw, unguarded tears of a man who'd been carrying a mountain on his back for a decade, and the weight had finally become unbearable. "Malik," Xavier said, and his voice cracked like ice on a spring river. "Malik Turner." And in that moment, Malik Turner felt the floor tilt beneath him, felt the walls of his small, invisible life begin to crack, felt the ghost of a past he'd buried 10 years ago rise from the grave and whisper his name. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another story. This is about every person you've ever walked past without seeing, every janitor, every server, every worker whose face you can't remember because society taught you they don't matter. But they do matter. And sometimes, just sometimes, their story will break your heart wide open and remind you what it means to be human. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever sacrificed everything and got nothing in return, if you've ever wondered whether doing the right thing is worth the cost, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but for every invisible hero who needs their story told. Because by the end of this, you're going to see the world differently. I promise you that. 24 hours earlier, Malik's morning had begun the way it always did, with the taste of instant coffee and the sound of Chicago's South Side waking up around him. His studio apartment on East 71st Street wasn't much, a mattress on the floor, a hot plate that worked 3 days out of 7, walls thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Patterson's television through the drywall reciting the morning news like a prayer. But it was his. He'd paid for it with night shifts and double shifts, with knees that ached from kneeling on cold floors, with hands that bore the chemical burns of industrial cleaners. At 47 years old, Malik Turner had become a master of invisibility. He moved through the world like air, necessary but unnoticed, essential but unremarked upon. The shower ran lukewarm at best. Malik stood under the weak stream, letting the water wash away another night of labor, another shift of erasure. His reflection in the foggy mirror showed a man who had once been something else: broader shoulders, brighter eyes, a jawline that held confidence instead of resignation. That man was gone. That man had died on a September afternoon 10 years ago, when the FAA investigation concluded, when the license was revoked, when the settlements took everything except the clothes on his back and the memory of what it felt like to fly. Malik Turner had been a pilot once, not just any pilot, one of the best. He'd flown commercial routes from Midwest Express, had accumulated over 15,000 hours in the air, had held the controls of aircraft that carried hundreds of souls from one destination to another with the precision of a surgeon and the grace of a dancer. Until Flight 1847, until the engine failure at 8,000 feet, until the emergency landing in the cornfields outside of Springfield, Illinois, that saved 143 lives but destroyed his own. The investigation had been merciless. Pilot error, they said, failure to follow protocol. Never mind that the engines had failed simultaneously, a 1 in a million mechanical nightmare that no amount of training could have prevented. Never mind that every passenger had walked away with nothing worse than bruises and shock. Never mind that Malik had threaded that dying aircraft through the eye of a needle and set it down in a field with the gentleness of a father laying his child to sleep. The snowshoes came anyway. The FAA suspension became permanent. The savings evaporated under the weight of legal fees and medical expenses for the few passengers who'd been injured. And Malik Turner, who had once touched the sky, found himself cleaning toilets on the 53rd floor of a Chicago skyscraper. He dressed in the dark, the same navy blue janitor uniform he wore every night, the same work shoes that had seen better years, the same ID badge that granted him access to spaces where he didn't belong after the executives went home. At 3:47 p.m., Malik boarded the Red Line train heading north, his cleaning supplies tucked in a worn duffel bag, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The car smelled of rain and regret. A teenager with headphones bobbed his head to music Malik couldn't hear. An elderly woman clutched her purse like it was the last piece of hope in the world. Malik saw himself in her, holding on to something intangible, something that memory insisted was real, even when reality said otherwise. By 5 p.m., he was at Vanguard Global Industries, swiping his badge through the service entrance while the last of the executives streamed out through the marble lobby. They moved past him like water around a stone, present but unacknowledged, necessary but invisible. But on that particular Monday evening, something was different in the air of the 53rd floor. Malik felt it the moment he stepped off the service elevator. A tension, a charge, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Voices carried from the boardroom, angry voices. Malik knew better than to listen. He'd learned that curiosity was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, but the words found him anyway, seeping under the door like smoke. "Completely unacceptable, Xavier," a woman's voice, sharp as broken glass. "We've lost the Meridian contract because you refused to take the meeting in Mumbai. Your board is questioning your commitment." "My commitment?" That was Xavier Caldwell's voice, controlled, measured, but with an edge beneath it like a blade hidden in velvet. "I built this company from the ground up while you were in business school, Margaret. Don't lecture me about commitment." "Then stop acting like you're above the work," Margaret's voice rose, cracking the professional veneer. "You can't keep flying commercial on these trips. You can't keep refusing the company jet. You're a billionaire, for God's sake. Act like one." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Then Xavier's voice, quieter now, but no less powerful. "I'll take the jet when hell freezes over, Margaret. And if the board has a problem with that, they can find themselves a new CEO." The boardroom door burst open. Margaret Sullivan, Chief Operating Officer, a woman whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded her like a storm warning, stormed out, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. She didn't see Malik. She never did. But Xavier Caldwell saw him. For just a moment, as Xavier emerged from the boardroom with his tie loosened and his jaw tight, his eyes met Malik's, and something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but something older, something that felt like gravity. Then the moment broke. Xavier turned toward his private office, and Malik returned to his cart, to his mop, to his invisibility. He didn't know that Xavier Caldwell had frozen in his office doorway, didn't know that the Billionaire CEO had gripped the doorframe with white knuckles, his heart suddenly thundering in his chest for reasons he couldn't name. Didn't know that something about the janitor's face, the weathered brown skin, the quiet dignity in those tired eyes, the way he carried himself like a man who'd once stood taller, had triggered a memory Xavier had been chasing for 10 years. A memory of a voice on a radio frequency, calm and steady even as the world fell apart. A memory of strong hands lifting his daughter from the wreckage of Seat 14C. A memory of a name spoken once by an emergency responder in that cornfield outside Springfield. The pilot's name is Turner, Malik Turner. Xavier Caldwell's hand trembled as he closed his office door. His breath came short and sharp, the way it had on that September afternoon when he'd gotten the call that his daughter's flight had gone down, that she'd been on a plane that was falling from the sky. And now, 10 years later, the ghost of that nightmare walked the halls of his building with a mop and a bucket, invisible to everyone but him. Xavier moved to his desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, the one he never opened, the one that held the things too painful to look at but too precious to throw away, and pulled out a folder. The folder was simply labeled Flight 1847. Inside were newspaper clippings, FAA reports, passenger manifests, and photographs. A photograph of the wreckage in the cornfield, the aircraft split but intact, the cornstalks bent beneath its belly like the earth itself had reached up to catch it, and a photograph of the pilot, taken from his commercial license, a younger man, broader in the shoulders, confidence bright in his eyes. Malik Turner. Xavier's vision blurred. His hands shook as he held the photograph next to the memory of the man he'd just seen in the hallway. Older now, worn down by life, but unmistakably the same. The man who'd saved his daughter's life was cleaning his floors. And Xavier Caldwell, who'd spent 10 years trying to find him, who'd hired private investigators and poured millions into a search that turned up nothing, had just walked past him like he was invisible. The realization hit Xavier like a physical blow, the cold sting of injustice, the weight of 1,000 missed opportunities pressing down on his chest until he couldn't breathe. He'd been looking for a hero, but heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and carry the wounds of a world that didn't recognize their sacrifice. Xavier stood from his desk, his decision already made. He didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know how Malik Turner had fallen so far, didn't know why the man who'd saved 143 lives had ended up cleaning toilets in a building he owned. But he was going to find out, and he was going to make it right, even if it cost him everything.
The next morning, Xavier Caldwell did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He called in a favor from someone who could dig where others couldn't.
"Dimitri," Xavier said into the phone, his office door locked, the blinds drawn against the Chicago skyline. "I need everything you can find on a man named Malik Turner, former commercial pilot, lost his license 10 years ago after Flight 1847. Dmitry Volkov, former FSB, current private investigator who specialized in the kind of information that didn't appear in public records, made a sound like a cat who'd found a mouse. How fast do you need it? Yesterday. It'll cost you.
"I don't care what it costs," Xavier said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who'd built empires and toppled competitors, but who'd never forgotten the feeling of his daughter's hand in his on that hospital bed in Springfield, alive because a stranger had decided that 143 lives mattered more than his own safety. "I need to know everything. Where he's been, what happened to him, why he's cleaning floors instead of flying." "Give me 6 hours," Dimitri said, and the line went dead. Xavier spent those 6 hours in a kind of suspended animation. He sat through meetings without hearing a word. He signed documents without reading them. Margaret Sullivan asked him 3 times if he was feeling well, her concern thinly veiling her irritation. "I'm fine," Xavier lied, and returned to his office to wait. At 4:37 p.m., his private line rang. "You're not going to like this," Dimitri said without preamble. "Tell me." And Dimitri did. The story that unfolded was a masterclass in injustice, a tragic opera of a system that crushes those who can't afford to fight back. Malik Turner had been one of the best pilots in commercial aviation. 15,000 hours, 0 incidents, commendations from passengers and crew alike. A reputation for calm under pressure and an almost supernatural ability to read the sky. Then came Flight 1847, a routine trip from Chicago to Atlanta that became a nightmare at 8,000 feet when both engines failed simultaneously. A mechanical failure so rare that it occurred in less than 0.01% of flights. The kind of catastrophic malfunction that shouldn't have been survivable. But Malik Turner had made it survivable. He'd glided that dead aircraft for 3.5 minutes, an eternity in the air, searching for a place to set it down that wouldn't kill everyone on board. He'd rejected the highway, too many cars, too much risk of collateral casualties. He'd rejected the residential area, too many homes, too many families. He'd threaded the aircraft between power lines and cell towers, bleeding altitude with surgical precision, and set that plane down in a cornfield outside Springfield with a landing so controlled that the fuselage remained intact. 143 people walked away. 3 sustained minor injuries, broken bones, lacerations, none life-threatening. It should have been a miracle. It should have made Malik Turner a hero. Instead, it made him a scapegoat. The airline's insurance company, facing massive payouts for the mechanical failure, found a technicality in Malik's adherence to emergency protocol. He deviated from the recommended procedure by refusing to attempt a return to the departure airport, a decision that, given the rapid loss of altitude, would have resulted in the aircraft crashing into downtown Springfield with catastrophic loss of life. But the manual said return to the airport when possible, and the lawyers argued that Malik's decision, however correct in the moment, violated protocol. The FAA, under pressure from the airline's legal team and their own desire to avoid liability, suspended Malik's license pending investigation. The investigation dragged on for 18 months. During that time, Malik couldn't work. His savings evaporated. His house went into foreclosure. His wife, unable to bear the weight of the financial and emotional stress, filed for divorce. When the investigation finally concluded with a permanent revocation based on failure to follow established emergency procedures, Malik Turner had nothing left. No career, no savings, no family. Just the memory of 143 lives saved and the knowledge that the system decided his sacrifice wasn't worth protecting. He disappeared after that. Dimitri's contacts found scattered records, odd jobs in warehouses, a brief stint at a gas station in Gary, Indiana, a few months working construction before a back injury ended that. Then, 3 years ago, he'd resurfaced in Chicago as a janitor for Vanguard Global Industries, hired through a third-party contractor that didn't ask questions and didn't care about his past. "There's one more thing," Dimitri said, his voice softer now. "Your daughter was on that flight, seat 14C, 14 years old at the time, flying to visit her grandmother in Atlanta." Xavier's breath caught in his throat. "I know," Xavier whispered. "The passenger manifest shows she was one of the 3 injured. Broken arm, concussion. The report says the pilot personally carried her from the wreckage and stayed with her until the paramedics arrived." The room spun. Xavier gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, his vision blurring. "Sarah," His daughter, Sarah, who was now 24 and finishing her graduate degree at Northwestern. Sarah, who'd walked away from that crash with nightmares that lasted years, but a life that was still hers to live. Sarah, who didn't remember the face of the man who'd lifted her from the wreckage because she'd been drifting in and out of consciousness. But Xavier remembered. He remembered arriving at the hospital, remembered the way the nurses had told him how lucky his daughter was, how the pilot had refused to leave the scene until every passenger was accounted for, remembered trying to find Malik Turner afterwards, trying to thank him, only to be told that the pilot was unavailable, that the investigation was ongoing, that it was best not to make contact. And then the investigation had concluded, and Malik Turner had vanished, and Xavier's attempts to find him had turned up nothing. Until now. Until a Monday night when Xavier had walked past him in the hallway without recognizing the ghost of his own salvation. "Dmitri," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "I need one more thing. Name it. I need to know everything Malik Turner has lost. Every debt, every missed payment, every dream that died when that license was revoked. I want numbers, I want names, I want to know exactly what it will take to restore what was taken from him." "Xavier," Dimitri's voice carried a warning. "What you're talking about could take years. The FAA doesn't overturn permanent revocations. The union won't touch him. The airlines—" "I don't care," Xavier said, and his voice carried the cold fury of a man who'd built a fortune on the belief that nothing was impossible if you were willing to pay the price. "That man saved my daughter's life. He saved 143 lives, and the world thanked him by taking everything. I'm going to give it back. All of it. Starting tonight."
The executive locker room on the 53rd floor of Vanguard Global Industries was designed for men who'd conquered the world. Italian marble, brushed nickel fixtures, lockers made of mahogany that cost more than most people earned in a year. It was a temple to success, a sanctuary for those who'd climbed to the top and intended to stay there. Xavier Caldwell stood in that temple at 11:32 p.m. on a Tuesday night, holding a pair of worn-out Skechers work shoes, and felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. He'd dismissed his driver. He'd sent his assistant home. He'd told the security team he'd be working late and didn't want to be disturbed. Then he'd waited, watching the security feed on his phone until he saw Malik Turner swipe his badge at the service entrance and enter the building. Xavier had taken the shoes from Malik's locker, a violation he knew but necessary for what he needed to do. He'd set them on the bench, and then he'd knelt. The position felt foreign, uncomfortable. His $1,000 suit wasn't made for kneeling. His pride wasn't built for this kind of humility. But Xavier Caldwell had learned long ago that the truest power wasn't in standing above others. It was in recognizing when you were standing on the shoulders of giants you'd never properly thanked. He applied the polish with careful strokes, each motion deliberate. The shoes were old, beaten down by years of labor, the soles worn thin from walking floors that men like Xavier never touched. These shoes had carried Malik Turner through a decade of erasure, a decade of invisibility, a decade of survival in the shadows of the world Xavier had built. And 10 years ago, the feet in these shoes had walked through the wreckage of Flight 1847, carrying passengers to safety, including a 14-year-old girl who would grow up to be Xavier's entire world. The leather began to shine under Xavier's careful attention. He worked in silence, the weight of unpaid debts settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. The hum of the fluorescent lights kept time with his breathing. The smell of polish filled the air, a humble scent, honest work, the kind of labor that built character instead of fortunes. That's when he heard the creak of the door. That's when he heard Malik's fractured voice. "Mr. Caldwell?" Xavier's hands stilled. His heart thundered. The moment had arrived, and suddenly all his carefully planned words evaporated like morning fog. He raised his head and met Malik Turner's eyes, and the tears came, not from pain, but from the overwhelming weight of finally being in the presence of the man he'd been searching for, the man who'd saved his daughter, the man the world had failed.
Xavier said, and his voice broke like ice on a spring river. "Malik," Xavier said. "Malik Turner." He watched the recognition dawn slowly in Malik's eyes, watched confusion give way to something deeper, not understanding yet, but the beginning of it, the first crack in a dam that had held back a decade of grief. Xavier stood slowly, the shoes still in his hands. September 17th, 2015, Flight 1847 from Chicago to Atlanta. Both engines failed at 8,000 feet. You brought that plane down in a cornfield outside Springfield. 143 people walked away. Malik's face had gone ashen. His hand gripped the doorframe as if the floor beneath him had turned to water. Seat 14C, a 14-year-old girl. Broken arm, concussion. You carried her from the wreckage yourself. You stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. You told her, Xavier's voice caught, remembering Sarah's hazy recollection from the hospital, words she'd barely remembered but that had stayed with Xavier like a prayer. You told her, "You're safe now. I've got you." Malik's legs seemed to give out. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall, his breathing rapid and shallow. "That girl was my daughter," Xavier said, and now the tears came freely, running down his cheeks like rivers carving canyons. "Her name is Sarah. She's 24 now. She's alive, she's brilliant, she's kind, she's everything, and she's here because of you." "No," Malik whispered, shaking his head, his own eyes bright with tears. "No, they took my license. They said I failed. They said I violated protocol. I lost everything. I couldn't save." "You saved everyone," Malik interrupted, his voice fierce now, carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded boardrooms and moved billions. "You saved everyone, Malik. Every single person on that plane went home to their families because you threaded the needle when no one else could have, because you made the right choice even when the manual said otherwise, because you put 143 lives ahead of your own career, your own safety, your own future." Xavier set the shoes down gently on the bench and closed the distance between them. "And the world thanked you by taking everything." Xavier's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of granite. "I spent 10 years trying to find you, 10 years trying to thank you, 10 years trying to make it right. And you've been here, cleaning my floors, invisible to everyone, including me, because the system decided your sacrifice wasn't worth protecting." "Mr. Caldwell, Malik's voice failed him. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing through a decade of pain, suddenly breaking open like a wound. "My name is Xavier," Xavier said, "and he did something no billionaire CEO had ever done in the history of that building. He took Malik Turner's calloused, chemical-burned hands in his own and held them like they were sacred things. I'm needing you to hear this, Malik. Are you listening?" Malik nodded, unable to speak. "I'm going to give you back everything they took from you," Xavier said, and his voice carried the certainty of a man who'd moved mountains and would move heaven itself if necessary. "Xavier, Malik's voice was a broken thing, barely held together. "Yes, you can," Xavier said firmly. "You flew a dead aircraft through the eye of a needle and brought everyone home. You can do anything." The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of 10 years of pain acknowledged, full of sacrifice finally recognized, full of the space between what was and what could be. Then Malik Turner, the invisible janitor, the man who'd lost everything, the pilot whose wings had been clipped by a system that valued protocol over heroism, did something unexpected. He laughed. It started as a single breath, a release of pressure that had been building for a decade. Then it grew, spilling out of him like light through a cracked door, mixing with tears until Xavier couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I polished those shoes for 3 years, Malik said through his laughter and tears. 3 years of walking these floors, and you just polished them back, Xavier finished, and found himself laughing too, the absurdity and profundity of the moment colliding into something that felt like grace. They stood there, in the executive locker room, a billionaire and a janitor, a CEO and a pilot, a father and the man who'd saved his daughter, and laughed until the weight of injustice felt just a little bit lighter.
The morning sun turned Lake Michigan into liquid gold outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Xavier's office. Malik sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than 6 months of his salary, a cup of coffee, real coffee, the kind that came from beans instead of crystals, warming his hands. Xavier sat across from him, not behind his imposing desk, but in the matching chair beside Malik, the position deliberately chosen. They were equals in this moment. They'd always been equals, even when the world insisted otherwise. Between them on the coffee table lay a folder. Inside that folder was Malik Turner's entire life, the wreckage and the hope both. I had my team work through the night, Xavier said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion around his eyes. Here's what we know. The FAA revocation was based on a technicality in emergency protocol, specifically your decision not to attempt to return to the departure airport. That decision saved lives. Downtown Springfield would have been a catastrophe. Malik nodded slowly, his hands tight around the coffee cup. The airline's insurance company pressured the FAA because a pilot error ruling reduced their liability, Xavier continued. The union didn't fight for you because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because you weren't a high seniority pilot. You didn't have the political capital. The investigation became about protecting the system rather than serving justice. I know, Malik said quietly. I knew then, too, but I couldn't afford lawyers who could fight it. I lost everything just trying to survive the investigation. Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze direct and unwavering. Here's what's going to happen, Xavier said, and his voice carried the certainty of a man who'd never heard the word impossible and meant it. First, I've retained Whitmore and Associates, the best aviation law firm in the country. They're filing a motion to reopen your case with the FAA, citing new evidence of mechanical failure and procedural irregularities in the original investigation. Malik's breath caught. Second, Xavier continued, I've reached out to the Airline Pilots Association. Let's say I've made it very clear that supporting your reinstatement is in their best interest. They're prepared to issue a formal apology and back your license restoration. Xavier, that could take years. It won't, Xavier interrupted gently, because third, I've purchased a controlling interest in Midwest Express. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Malik stared at Xavier, his mouth open, no words coming out. As of 7 a.m. this morning, I own 51% of the airline that fired you, Xavier said, and a small smile played at the corner of his mouth, not triumphant, but satisfied. The smile of a man who just moved a mountain because someone had told him it was impossible. Which means I have the authority to not only reinstate you pending FAA approval, but to ensure that your personnel file reflects the truth, that you're a hero who saved 143 lives through skill and courage. Malik's voice cracked. I don't understand. Why would you... The cost? The cost is irrelevant, Xavier said simply. You gave my daughter her life. How do you put a price on that? How do you calculate the worth of being able to watch her graduate college, to see her smile, to hear her laugh? You gave me 24 more years with Sarah, and I've spent them trying to find you so I could say thank you. He reached across the space between them and placed his hand on Malik's shoulder. But this isn't just about Sarah, Xavier continued, his voice dropping to something softer, more personal. This is about the fact that the world is full of people who do extraordinary things, and we let them fall through the cracks because they don't have the money to fight back. You deserved better, Malik, and I'm in a position to give you better. So that's what I'm going to do." Malik's tears fell freely now, running down his face and into his beard. He didn't try to hide them, didn't try to maintain the stoic mask he'd worn for 3 years of invisibility. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Then don't say anything yet. Just listen to part 4. He opened the folder and pulled out a document, official letterhead, corporate seal, the weight of institutions behind every word. "I'm creating a new division of Vanguard Global, Vanguard Aviation Solutions. It will focus on pilot training, aviation safety consultation, and emergency response protocols. And I want you to run it." Malik's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Not as a janitor," Xavier clarified with a slight smile, "as the CEO, as the face of a company built on the principle that when someone does the right thing should happen to them." "Xavier, I haven't flown in 10 years. I don't have experience running a company. "You have 15,000 hours of flight experience," Xavier interrupted. "You have the respect of every pilot who's ever read about Flight 1847 and understood what you did. You have the moral authority that comes from sacrificing everything to save others. That's worth more than any business degree." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Besides," Xavier added, "you won't be alone. I'll be there. My team will be there. We'll build this together. And when you're ready to fly again, when the FAA reinstates your license and you're sitting in a cockpit for the first time in 10 years, I want to be your first passenger." The weight of it all crashed over Malik like a wave. 10 years of grief and loss, 3 years of invisible labor, the memory of Sarah's small hand in his as he carried her from the wreckage, and now this impossible offer of restoration that felt too good to be real. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why go this far?"
Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, looking at something beyond the Chicago skyline. "Because my daughter was dying," he said finally, his voice rough with old fear, "and you gave her back to me. But more than that, because I've spent my entire life building things, acquiring things, winning things, and I realized last night, kneeling on that floor with your shoes in my hands, that none of it matters if we don't use what we have to lift up the people who've been knocked down." He met Malik's eyes again, and there was steel there alongside the compassion. "You didn't just save lives that day, Malik. You showed everyone what real courage looks like, what real sacrifice means, and the world tried to bury you for it. Well, I'm not going to let that stand. Not now, not ever." The sun climbed higher outside the windows, painting the office in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere far below, the city of Chicago stirred to life, millions of people moving through their days, most of them never knowing about the moment of grace happening 53 floors above them. Malik Turner set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. He looked at the folder on the table, at the documents that promised restoration. He looked at Xavier Caldwell, the billionaire CEO who'd gotten on his knees to polish a janitor's shoes. And he made a decision. "Okay," Malik said, and the word carried the weight of a man stepping back into the light after a decade in darkness. "Okay, let's do this." Xavier's smile was brighter than the sunrise behind him. "Welcome back to the sky, Captain Turner." Someone who sacrificed everything needs to know they're not forgotten. Hit that like button if you believe mercy is stronger than systems. Subscribe if you think justice should win. Comment below and tell me about the invisible hero in your life, the person who saved you and nobody thanked. The conference room on the 53rd floor of Vanguard Global Industries was packed wall to wall with press when Margaret Sullivan arrived at 9 a.m. the following Monday. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled every seat. The air crackled with anticipation and the smell of expensive coffee. Margaret had called this emergency meeting of the board and senior leadership, concerned about Xavier's increasingly erratic behavior over the past week, the sudden acquisition of Midwest Express, the mysterious new division being created, and the rumors of a major announcement.
She'd expected resistance. She'd prepared a presentation on fiduciary responsibility and the risks of emotional decision-making. What she hadn't expected was to walk into the room and find Malik Turner, the janitor, sitting at the head of the table beside Xavier, wearing a suit that fit him like dignity restored. "What the hell is this?" Margaret demanded, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Xavier stood, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built empires, "I'd like to introduce you to Captain Malik Turner, the new CEO of Vanguard Aviation Solutions and the man who saved my daughter's life." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Margaret's face went from confusion to fury in the span of a heartbeat. Xavier raised his hand, and the chaos subsided. 10 years ago, Flight 1847 experienced a catastrophic dual-engine failure at 8,000 feet. Captain Turner, through skill and courage, brought that aircraft down in a cornfield outside Springfield and saved 143 lives. My daughter Sarah was one of them. She was 14 years old. She's alive today because this man made the hardest choice a pilot can make. He put everyone else first. He met Malik's eyes again, and there was steel there alongside the compassion. "You didn't just save lives that day, Malik. You showed everyone what real courage looks like, what real sacrifice means, and the world tried to bury you for it. Well, I'm not going to let that stand. Not now, not ever." The assembled press and board members watched stunningly as the billionaire CEO honored a janitor like a king. "Any questions?" Xavier asked the assembled room. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune raised her hand. "Captain Turner," she said, directing her question to Malik, "what do you want people to know about what happened to you?"
Malik stood slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was steady despite the emotion behind it. "I want people to know that every day there are people who do extraordinary things," he said. "Nurses who stay late to hold a patient's hand, teachers who spend their own money on supplies for students, first responders who run toward danger while everyone else runs away, and most of them never get recognized. Most of them struggle to make ends meet. Most of them wonder if their sacrifice matters." His voice grew stronger, powered by 10 years of carrying this weight. "It matters," he said firmly. "Every act of courage matters. Every sacrifice counts. And we need to build a world where doing the right thing doesn't cost you everything, where heroism is honored instead of punished, where the people who save lives don't end up cleaning floors because the system failed them." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Xavier gave me back my future," Malik continued. "But I don't want this to be about just me. I want Vanguard Aviation Solutions to be a place where we protect the protectors, where we lift up the people who've been knocked down, where we prove that mercy and justice aren't weaknesses, they're the foundation of true strength." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled frantically. And in the back of the room, unnoticed by everyone except Xavier, a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes watched the proceedings with tears streaming down her face. Sarah Caldwell, 24 years old, graduate student at Northwestern, survivor of Flight 1847, watched the man who'd saved her life receive the recognition he'd always deserved. After the press conference ended, after the reporters filed out and the board members departed, some energized, others visibly shaken by Xavier's demonstration of power, Sarah approached Malik. "Captain Turner," she said softly. Malik turned, and something in his eyes shifted when he saw her. Recognition flickered, not of her face, but of something deeper. The echo of a 14-year-old girl's frightened eyes staring up at him from the wreckage of seat 14C. "You're Sarah," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "I am," she confirmed, "and I wanted to say, I don't remember much from that day, just fragments. The sound of the engines failing, the sensation of falling, and then—" she paused, swallowing hard, "and then your voice, telling me I was safe, that you had me."
Malik's composure crumbled. He pulled Sarah into a hug, and Xavier watched as his daughter embraced the man who'd given her a future, the man who'd walked through fire and carried her to safety, the man who'd paid for that act of heroism with everything he had. "Thank you," Sarah whispered into Malik's shoulder. "Thank you for my life." "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going," Malik replied. And in that moment, 10 years of pain found purpose. The consequences for those who'd failed Malik Turner unfolded with the precision of justice delayed but not denied. The FAA, faced with a lawsuit from the nation's most prestigious aviation law firm and public pressure generated by the viral press conference, reopened Malik's case within 3 weeks. The investigation took 4 months. When it concluded, the FAA issued a formal apology and reinstated Captain Malik Turner's commercial pilot license with full privileges. The airline's insurance company that had pressured for the pilot error ruling faced a class action lawsuit from Flight 1847 passengers who'd been denied proper compensation due to the false narrative. The settlement cost them $847 million, a number Xavier insisted on to match the flight number that changed everything. Margaret Sullivan found that being fired by a billionaire CEO in front of the international press was not ideal for one's career prospects. Her calls to other Fortune 500 companies went unanswered. Her reputation as a cutthroat operator who prioritized profit over people preceded her everywhere she tried to land. 6 months later, she was working as a consultant in Des Moines, her empire reduced to a studio apartment and the bitter knowledge that integrity ultimately matters more than ruthlessness. But the real payback wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Vanguard Aviation Solutions launched with Malik Turner as CEO and became the fastest-growing aviation safety consultancy in the industry. Airlines contracted with them to develop better emergency protocols. Pilot training programs adopted Malik's approach to crisis management. Within 2 years, 3 separate emergency landings credited Vanguard Aviation Solutions training with saving lives. Malik's personal life transformed as well. His ex-wife reached out, not to reconcile romantically, but to apologize for not standing by him when he needed support most. They built a friendship based on mutual respect and shared history. His daughter, who'd been 8 years old when everything fell apart, and now 18 and college-bound, reconnected with him. She'd never stopped loving her father. She'd just been too young to fight the currents that swept him away. And 9 months after the press conference, on a clear spring morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Captain Malik Turner sat in the cockpit of a Vanguard global corporate jet for the first time in a decade. In the passenger cabin behind him sat 3 people: Xavier Caldwell, Sarah Caldwell, and Dmitry Volkov, the Russian investigator who'd helped find Malik's story and insisted on being present for his first flight back. "Tower, this is Vanguard 1 requesting clearance for departure," Malik said into the radio, his voice steady, professional. "Home. Vanguard 1, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 28, and Captain Turner." The air traffic controller's voice carried a warmth that transcended protocol. "Welcome back to the sky." Malik's hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that 10 years couldn't erase. The engines spooled up, the aircraft rolled forward, gathering speed, the runway lights blurring into a stream of white and gold. And then, at exactly the right moment, the moment that pilots know in their bones, the moment that separates Earth from heaven, Malik pulled back on the controls. The aircraft lifted. In the passenger cabin, Sarah gripped her father's hand and watched through the window as the ground fell away, as Chicago became a toy city below them, as they climbed toward the clouds that Malik Turner had been denied for a decade. "How does it feel?" Xavier asked Malik through the intercom, his voice thick with emotion. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the infinite blue stretching before him. "Like coming home," he said finally. "Like mercy. Like justice. Like the weight of the world finally lifting." The aircraft climbed higher, breaking through the cloud layer into sunlight so bright it hurt to look at. And Captain Malik Turner, survivor, heroine, the man who saved 143 lives and paid for it with everything, who'd cleaned floors and polished shoes and carried the weight of injustice for 10 years, finally spread his wings again.
In the corporate offices of Vanguard Global Industries, there's a plaque now mounted in the main lobby where everyone entering the building must see it. It reads, True leadership isn't measured by what you acquire. It's measured by what you restore. Success isn't about climbing higher. It's about reaching down to lift up those who've been knocked down. And justice isn't complete until those who sacrifice everything for others are protected, honored, and given back what they've lost. This company exists to prove that mercy and justice aren't weaknesses. They're the foundation of true strength. Dedicated to Captain Malik Turner, and to every person who's ever done the right thing and paid the price. Below the plaque, visitors are invited to contribute to the Turner Foundation, a nonprofit Xavier and Malik created together to provide legal and financial support to workers who've been unjustly terminated, particularly those in safety-critical roles who've been scapegoated for systemic failures. The foundation has helped 47 people in its first year. Nurses who were fired for reporting unsafe conditions, construction workers who lost their jobs for refusing to violate safety regulations, teachers who were terminated for protecting vulnerable students. Each person who receives support from the Turner Foundation gets a letter, personally signed by Malik, that includes a single line: "Your sacrifice matters. You are not invisible. We've got you." Because at the end of the day, the story of Malik Turner and Xavier Caldwell isn't just about one janitor and one CEO. It's about a fundamental truth that society forgets too often. The people who save us, the nurses, the pilots, the first responders, the teachers, the workers who put others first, they deserve more than our gratitude. They deserve our protection. They deserve justice. They deserve to be seen. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe aligns in such a way that the invisible becomes visible, that the fallen are lifted up, that the weight of injustice is balanced by the power of mercy. Sometimes a billionaire kneels to polish a janitor's shoes. And in that gesture, that act of humility from the powerful to honor the powerless, the world shifts just a little bit closer to what it should be. A place where heroism is protected instead of punished. A place where sacrifice is honored instead of exploited. A place where the right thing isn't the hardest thing, it's the thing that brings you home. Captain Malik Turner is still flying, still teaching, still proving that the sky isn't the limit when you've been to hell and back. And Xavier Caldwell is still leading Vanguard Global Industries, but with a different metric of success now. Not quarterly earnings, not market share, but the number of lives transformed, the number of people lifted up, the number of invisible heroes finally seen. Because in the end, we're all just passengers on this flight together, and the measure of our humanity is whether we help the pilot land safely or whether we let them crash and burn while we save ourselves. Choose wisely. The sky is watching.